a.m. in Dubai, and Brent crude oil is trading up 1.5%. It has pared back this sort of early gains this morning in Asia, and it sort of popped up to $90 Brent, but it is now back to 88.50 and sort of absorbing the news overnight of Israel's attack on Iran. Again, sort of breaking through that red line of Israel now directly attacking Iran, as Iran did so last weekend, all triggered by the April 1st events of Israel targeting and destroying a part of the Iranian consulate in Syria, killing a number of senior Iranian military officials. So that's sort of the April drama that we've seen. Dr. Iman Nasseri, Managing Director, Middle East, FGE Dubai. It doesn't appear that this oil market has absorbed that we've crossed a red line here, that we have these two major regional foes who've spent the last 40 years in a proxy dance, have crossed the red line and target each other directly, and the oil markets are going, what's the big deal? But is there a red line here that's crossed that requires a larger geopolitical premium? Your thoughts?
Yes. What you described is exactly what's happening. The reason is that, two reasons come to mind. One is that part of this geopolitical risk has been already incorporated and basically added to the price or priced into the market over the past couple of weeks since it all happened. So when we look at fundamentals and when we basically try to put a price to where the fundamentals are, we find the price $5 to $10 premium in the price. Obviously, that's just accumulated total risk premium that we have multiple kind of risk at the moment in the market, risk of supply. That's one thing. The second is that I believe there might be a consensus in the market that so far is Iran's response and now Israel's kind of response back to Iran's attack has been controlled, contained, and with the intention not to escalate into a war. All signs of both events that happened over the past last weekend and now indicate that it's a very contained reaction. They have to do that for politics, domestic politics, and other reasons within the system. But they have done it in such a way that the other way can claim failure of the attacker and with little to no casualty. And hence, that's basically the market's reading and reaction that it's not going to escalate into a war. There is no impact on supply.
Peter McGuire, CEO of XM Australia. Peter, these events are happening at a time in which it would appear that all financial markets have run out of a little bit of bullish steam that we've seen of the last 6 months. How much of that is more the reality of the sort of somber oil price than sort of the political dramas in the Middle East? Your thoughts on the whole financial markets running out of steam?
Well, Sean, I think, and greetings from Sydney, you know, what we've seen over the last few days as far as US wipeout, I think it's been 5 successive sessions of downside for the S&P and for the NASDAQ. I think the Dow ended up in the green. Today was a washout. If you're looking at what happened in Tokyo, we were down, some of those markets were down 3.5% in Asia trade, and then they've pared back some of those losses. But still, it's been spanked down. China's down. One of the markets was down, I think, 4.5%. So, yeah, I think that was Taiwan. So it's certainly, Sean, there's, strip out the geopolitical, it's just, as you said, I think it's exhausted to the upside. We've seen a lot of choppiness across conversation and to the markets in the sense of, when's the rate cut? Oh, well, it's going to be March. I mean, we could roll our minds back. You and I were talking about it last year and said, oh, we'll have one by the end of 23. I'll have a couple in 24 and probably all done by the middle of the year. Well, we haven't even got off the blocks yet. Larry Summers is saying we're going to have a rate hike. So there's the first part of it. When do we see some sort of the inflation story? Energy prices at these sort of levels are impacting US dollar and what's happening to the likes of currencies. The yen's being 35 or 40-year lows nearly at 154, 155. You've got the euro sitting at 106, Aussie dollars through 64, the pound's as soft as anything. So there's not a lot of growth in those sectors. I think that America's growing at it's growing okay, Sean, but if you strip out some of those big companies, they're really having a big axe to their head count. There's plenty of government jobs under President Biden, but a lot are being hit pretty hard. So I think there's a lot of nervousness, there's a lot of frustration, and I think traders are sitting on the outside going, wow, do I just, take the money and it's been a great run and sit on the sidelines for a little while till this, we get some clear direction.
Michelle Weiss-Bachmann, Principal Analyst at Lloyd's List Intelligence. Michelle, meanwhile, back at the sort of physical realities of oil flows, we've seen questions emerge about further sanctions out of against Iran, if one can even find more sanctions to put up there. It looks like the US are going to reimpose sanctions on Venezuela. Where do you see these stacking up to impact physical oil flows, energy flows? Are we seeing any of that?
Good morning. No, not yet. What we are seeing is a really highly calibrated response. Over the weekend, last weekend, we saw the Iranian Revolutionary Armed Guards Navy Corps. They seized a container ship in retaliation for the Israel for what happened. And we saw the UK government designate that arm of the Armed Guards Corps over the week. We saw the reimposition of sanctions on Venezuela. I would say that if I was a vessel or a tanker with a US connection and I was sailing through the Strait of Hormuz now, I would be very, very wary. I think there's elevated risk, but there's been a lot of rhetoric about threats to the Strait of Hormuz traffic. I think that's empty and just playing out for domestic show. But there is definitely a risk of a tit-for-tat retaliatory exposure using.
But just again, Michelle, on that point, and I know we're all long enough in the tooth to have the old chestnut of closing the Strait of Hormuz seem like something quite empty. But again, an empty threat, if you like, and it obviously has never happened. But again, the red line thesis, we have crossed a red line. It might have been choreographed theater, everybody got to show that they can dance a certain way more than before, but ultimately a line has been crossed. Do we not have to put greater kind of weighting now in our analysis to the fact that the Hormuz a line could be crossed here, that it's no longer sufficient just to dismiss that outright? Your thoughts on where that falls in this red line crossing from a point of view of trade and shipping flows?
Well, my view is that that is not a likelihood, and that's because obviously the flow of oil, unlike the 80s and 90s, isn't going to the US, it's going to China. And also, I don't think Iran wants to antagonize other OPEC members. And of course, it's not just Iranian oil that's flowing out there. There's Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. So there's that consideration. And I think secondly, there's also the geopolitical concerns of Russia, the Black Sea, Venezuela. There's an axis evolving in the oil trading sector where you're seeing Iranian crude going to Russia, Russian crude, so there's a nexus that I think can withstand any of those threats.
And man, that's clearly the sort of key point Michelle makes. The new partners, Iran, which is essentially the protagonist that one would identify. And, there's no, as we said, historical evidence to indicate that they would do this or have ever done it. But ultimately, all of Iran and the Gulf's customers are now in Asia, and China, who did choreograph the rapprochement between Saudi and Iran last year, is the big customer and would be the big victim here. Your thoughts on the influence of China and China energy demand as a big new actor in the Gulf politics, if you like?
Yeah, first of all, I fully agree with Michel that the likelihood on closure of Strait of Hormuz is near zero, if anything. Yeah, the benefit of doing so for Iran is nothing but destroying the relationship with the partners and the customer, the main and sole customer of its own crude oil and products, as well as actually its own trade. There are exports of oil that Iran has to control, and if there is a war there, it will be victimized, as well as imports of other goods that they have. So with regard to the relationships within the region, yes, currently they are at a good relationship state with Saudi, with OPEC, with Qatar, which will also be subject to that matter. So that I have basically totally crossed out of our scenarios to happen. When some people talk about or try to compare it with Bab el-Mandab and the Houthis, that's a totally different situation. Houthis and Yemen doesn't have much of a stake in this game, especially the Houthis who are responsible for that. It's not like a nation like Iran, which has basically a significant footprint in the oil market, and also, as you mentioned, the relationship with China. And one quick comment about the sanctions that you mentioned also earlier today to Michel. My opinion is that any sanctions that may come in the following days will hardly have any implication on the Iranian oil flows to the market. That's not really Biden's strategy. That hasn't been over the past 3.5 years, and wouldn't be on an election year. They have already basically all the laws and maximum regulation against any trade of Iranian oil and any payments. So all they have to do is enforcement of those sanctions, which has been put on hold or really barely followed. But again, there was a reason for that, similar to the price cap that was enforced against Russian, for the barrels to come to the market and keep the prices check.
Peter, we talked a little earlier, obviously, about the sort of the financial markets running out of steam. The other sort of way of analyzing that is that the financial markets were guided by one major North Star over the last 6 months, that being a significant easing of the price of money. Rates were to come down. That has not happened. I mean, certainly not in the US, and the Fed outlook now is increasingly higher for longer rates, and maybe not even this year. I mean, once you get into the second half of 2024, you're right on the nose of the election, and it would seem a rather difficult time to lower rates. So my question to you, Peter, is what is the next North Star for the financial markets? Yes, they might be taking a pause, and I'm sure taking nice profits given the run-up in the last 6 months. But what's the next North Star for financial markets?
Well, I think the unknown, Sean, is what happens as far as inflation. Should crude and geopolitics, and we live and breathe this. I mean, it's very much this panel here today, and your good self, you're in the heart of it. You know this better than anyone. If crude was to jump, and something happens. And I mean, you know, if things really get out of hand and we've got to run that sort of scenario and they're up 15, 20 bucks or higher from here. I mean, we talk on international media. I'm talking to Vandana, our dear friend, as I speak. You know, she's doing TV back to back. I've done a couple today. It's the news is, and I mean, and I'm sure everyone's doing it. The anticipation from the marketplace is this: if crude gallops, then what happens to inflation? What does that, what in turn happens to rate policy? That's the star, Sean. If it turns on its head and we're now looking at a rate hike, you know, you go up 1 or 2. If crude went to 120 or 140 a barrel, what impact does that have to the equity markets, to inflation? And it changes the whole footprint as far as growth. What happens as far as policy? And where does the Fed sit and other central bankers? Because that's the unknown with that higher inflation story. That's the one that really, I think, is, and that maybe Larry Summers is onto something. I mean, you know, he's saying it's a 20% probability. That was last week, probably higher today.
Michelle, you mentioned there the shipping in the Straits of Hormuz would be certainly more stressed than it was a week ago before the Iranians detained that cargo ship, which is still detained, by the way. Are we seeing the shipping rates, the insurance rates? Are we getting any cuckoo in the coal mine indications there that there is more stress? I mean, when we had the events on the Red Sea over the last few months, rates went up and there was all sorts of issues there. Insurance wouldn't cover ships going in certain directions and so forth. Are we seeing anything, or where is rates and shipping vis-a-vis what they tell us about the general stress in the market and supply and demand?
Well, certainly shipping rates have been the winner, if there is a winner, in the geopolitical tension that we've seen. There is record oil on water at the moment. They're at record levels, and that's simply because oil is traveling further distances as a result of rerouting on the Red Sea. We're also seeing inefficient logistics strategies being used by Russia, Iran, and Venezuela in order to get their sanctioned oil to the market. And we're seeing a division of the market where you're seeing some tankers are able to call in certain areas and undertake certain cargoes. So yes, we're seeing, you know, very strong rates, even though demand growth is moderating from the levels that we've seen before. Without these geopolitical tensions, the global tanker rates would certainly be in, you know, a much lower place.
Didn't we see, Michelle, just to follow up on that, given the sort of more robust posture of the Americans on the sanctions enforcement, that a lot of shippers pulled back from what's called the dark fleet, or facilitating Russian oil that could be determined as violating sanctions? And what happened to all of those tankers? Have they not come back into the, I don't know what the opposite of dark fleet is, but the normal fleet, and so hence there would be a lot of supply? Or how has that played out, the withdrawal of ships from the dark fleet?
That's a great question, because this is probably one of the few success stories that OFAC, the US regulator, has been able to gain, because they have directly sanctioned about 40 tankers, and those tankers cannot trade. They're toxic. They're out of the market. The price cap and the intensification of regulations has shifted more oil onto the so-called dark fleet, parallel fleet of vessels that are trading outside Western jurisdiction. But I think regulators have realized they're onto something, but they have to very carefully choreograph those strategies, because they don't want to shift more oil outside, you know, outside the price cap, which is what's happened at the moment. They want to, in effect, pressure Russia to sell it below $60 a barrel. So I think we're at a really important point now where regulators are weighing up how they can deal with oil price cap breaches without interrupting the flow, because as we mentioned earlier, nobody wants to see what happened to oil prices what happened to gas prices after Russia invaded Ukraine. So, this is all a work in progress right now with regulators in the US, the UK, and Europe.
Keep everything flowing, but at a discounted price. It's a delicate balance. Let's go to the survey question, which sort of takes on the point I asked earlier. The energy markets, oil and gas, will likely have to start pricing in an even larger risk premium now that Iran and Israel have stepped across red line of attacking each other directly. The inference of this question is that the markets have not done so yet. They've even given up some of the risk premium that might have been already bedded in. So my thesis this morning is that the markets are going to have to start pricing in an even larger risk premium now that Iran and Israel have stepped across red line of attacking each other directly. I would imagine that would figure right across all actuaries' desks in the City of London, still trying to figure out what's at stake here. And rates, I would imagine, will generally rise at some point. That is insurance rates and with it everything else. But Iman, I wanted to get your thoughts. We have it as the #1 story on our digest this morning. The UAE foreign minister holds a telephone call with his Iranian counterpart earlier this morning in general times. It would appear that the phone call happened before the events became known of the Israeli strike. But nonetheless, it's the #1 story on the UAE national news agency. And that's why we have taken it, because it's that in itself is a message. The UAE foreign minister talking to the Iran foreign minister, #1 story on the WAM news agency, the UAE news agency. Your thoughts on what all of this means for regional relationships that obviously were under repair last year ahead of the October events? What do you take from this idea that the UAE would be posting such a story as the top story on their national state-owned news agency?
Yeah, well, that kind of confirms and reiterates what we were talking earlier about the Iranian relationship that has been on the improvement trajectory over the past year or so with the neighbors, with Saudi, with the UAE. And I want to also link this to your earlier comment about crossing red lines, Sean. Yes, the red lines were crossed after 40 plus years of Islamic Republic animosity and basically refusing to validate the regime of Israel as a nation. So they have not really interacted directly. But we have had a few other similar developments in this region, with Saudi basically getting near to re-establishing or establishing relationship with Israel, with the UAE basically, and all of that. And yet Iran was at the same time working with them. So I want to say that the equations have changed. We shouldn't really get so much kind of think about the red lines and whether or not they have really had any attack on each other's soil. So what is happening is that Iran has to consider its relationship with the UAE, Saudi, OPEC, for the benefit of their overall trade and regional geopolitics. And for that matter, what I see, in fact, during the last 20 odd minutes of our call, I have had the Twitter scroll in front in my screen, and I've seen that several officials from the Army, US Army, and high officials have mentioned, basically have tried to undermine and said that we're done with this. We're not even interested in looking at who has been behind this, and for us there is no response needed. So I'm sure they are on the trajectory
And
of
that
basically
was commentary from who? From Iran or
from Iran, basically. Yes,
Iran?
one is Abdul Rahim Musavi, the head of army, basically, who said that this was basically a few drones that we hit down, and there's no. And then there are other people who are basically more commenting on that line on social media. So I think that's basically taking all of these into account. There have been the UAE requirement, but or basically request, but also comments from the Saudis that this is a dangerous game if you start to escalate.
Peter, I wanted to get your thoughts on all things safe haven and FX. We've seen the dollar strengthen. Gold is on a tear. It's the only one that hasn't stopped going up, reached another record today, I think. And Bitcoin, of course, has been pulled back a bit, but also has been on a tear. How do you interpret the gold dollar piece? What does it tell you about the wider picture?
Well, Sean, I think if you've got to look at first off central bank buying, it's been an enormous appetite. If you're looking at the likes of what China, Turkey, and India have done in the last year, it just shoots the lights out. So there's the first part as far as central bank buying, and it's a common thread across many countries across the world. So their appetite for gold. Don't discount the price of silver either. I think that's probably got more opportunity from a percentage point of view than probably gold has. Gold stood there and now it's at over 2,400 an ounce. So and you've got a relatively strong dollar. So there must be a lot of fear in the market, Sean. You've got retail. Costco, they tell me, are selling $200 million worth of gold, physical gold per month to their customer base across America. So that's retail. And then the appetite is so strong. The man and woman on the street, if you go to India or the likes of where you are, Middle East, but even in Australia, people are talking about it. Where do I buy gold? What do I do? Or silver. So the appetite is very strong. US dollar has been the safe haven, and it's now
is that inflation? Is that inflation fear driven ultimately? I mean, the fact that inflation is bedding in regardless of what the central banks tell us?
Yes, I think so. I think that's really the hurt on Main Street. People are saying, well, property prices, are they nearly fully capped out? You've seen what gold's done. We had an $1,800 low going back to the early part of October. Here we are 6 months later, and the market's up 35%. So you can't say it hasn't moved. It's moved very, very aggressively. And I think, Sean, the appetite is people are saying from a safe haven perspective, how does 24 play? When do we see rate cuts? What's happening as far as, because consumers are saying, I've got plenty of skin in the game. I've got a mortgage, brother, or I'm paying car debt, or I've got, university debt for young people. Interest rates are only going up, not down. So there's plenty of hurt there. And people are saying, well, how do I hedge a little bit? And buying physical gold seems to be a common occurrence pretty much across the landscape of investor land everywhere you go.
Just to follow up on that, Peter, is yen still a safe haven currency? And I mean, after sort of collapsing to over 150 on the dollar from where it kind of sat as, 100 and something, 105, 104, whatever for most of our adult life, now we're at 150 plus. Is yen still a safe haven?
Well, I think, first off, you had negative interest rates, Sean, and then now you've gone back to line ball. So it was a trade, but everyone was short. So Mrs. Watanabe's cleaned up because she's realised they sell the yen, buy the dollar, and it's just been, every day is Christmas. It's been quite incredible from a return perspective. It's been very choppy. We're thinking about, does the yen have intervention? The Bank of Japan, keeps on talking, but they haven't done anything yet. So maybe you're going to see a bounce. But I think the other side of Japan is you've had a roaring Nikkei 225 that shot out 41,000 or so. So it just had that huge run up from 25,000, Sean. Everyone was long Japanese equities, and it's just been one-way traffic. So that's probably where the smart money went, because it was just extraordinary move to the upside.
Michelle Buckland, last word with you. I mean, one of the things that there we have sort of this divided room here. Agree, disagree, always good. Always feel good when my questions get a divided answer. Michelle, when the sanctions on Russia started vis-a-vis the oil price cap and so forth, it was believed generally that they could be effective because ultimately the City of London and its institutions that carry similar names as your own company, Lloyd's, they control the shipping marine insurance market, even though they mightn't control other things, but that is a big one in the hands of the city or in the hands of the West. Is that changing at all? Has this sort of dark fleet, the facilitation of such a large number of vessels and companies and others? I mean, there must be ports that are accepting these dark fleets with whatever insurance they're showing them. I'm wondering, question is there been any adjustment to the control of the City of London on all things marine insurance?
Well, unfortunately, what we have seen is that I would say about 80% of the shipments from Russia, Iran, and Venezuela are now undertaken on vessels whose insurance is outside the Western insurance system. So that raises serious safety and environmental concerns. The insurance industry, obviously, these tankers are sailing with insurance. Ingestruck, the Russian insurance provider, is providing most of the Russian and Iranian business. But there are concerns that the blue card, which is the certificates that say that who is liable if there is an oil spill, at the moment they're not really worth the paper that they're printed on. If a tanker calls in at a Russian port, whether or not they're insured with a Western insurance provider and under the cap or not, it's generally regarded that if the worst happens, that it's going to be very, very hard to find anybody that's able to provide any services. So, that's a big concern for the tanker shipping industry at the moment that they're grappling with.
But surely those ships are docking at ports, right? I mean, they're going wherever they're going all around the world. The ports must be part of this sort of dark fleet architecture. They must be accepting this paperwork. Is that not the case? I mean, how does that all work together?
Yeah, we're seeing 1.5 million barrels per day of US sanctioned Iranian crude is going to China and Syria with all this paperwork. So, is it a failure of port state control, or do they not recognize the jurisdiction of where the sanctions were imposed? There's a lot of moving parts here. In India, for example, Ingestruck is providing insurance for those cargoes that are coming in that are being sold, if you look at price reporting agencies, above the cap. And, that's once again something that regulators are grappling with and trying to calibrate their response so they can deal with those transgressions, in their opinion, yet keep oil flowing.
Well, I think it's an area to watch, as clearly these sanctions are growing, and now Venezuela's sanctions are coming back. So that crude is going to probably still flow, but instead of it being in the kind of gray, the green side, it'll be on the red side, or whatever way you want to look at it. But the flows will grow. Sanctioned flows are growing, and with it, the uncertain paperwork and insurance. We're going to have to wrap it up there. Lots obviously up in the air. I leave today, or wake up today in the Gulf feeling actually a little bit more optimistic than I have in a while, since April 1st, perhaps, if indeed this is Israel's response, and that's where they leave it. We don't know that yet. We haven't heard any announcements. Iran are playing it down. Will Tel Aviv also play it down? We'll have to wait and see. But Brent crude oil is telling us not much to look at here. Trading up only 1.3%. Seems sort of hard to believe that when one country, the Middle East, attacks another, two big actors like that, and the oil markets are telling us it's nothing to look at. Let's wait and see if that's the case. Thank you so much to all of our guests this morning. Michelle Bachmann, I really appreciate or Michelle Weiss Bachmann, I should say. Dr. Iman Nasri as well, of course, in Dubai, and of always Peter McGuire out there on the beaches of Australia. Really appreciate your time and contributions this morning. Have a great day, everybody. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you,
Bye,
Sean.
Michelle. See you online.